In the West, we have been living in a capitalist society since the Industrial Revolution, and it seems that since then our entire economic system has been deemed a failure by certain groups in our society. Hello, and welcome to The Aesthetic Philosophy. In today's video, I'm going to be exploring capitalism, but more so, I'm going to be looking at its criticisms. I'm also going to attempt to answer the question, why capitalism is failing us. Criticism of capitalism ranges from expressing disagreement with the principles of capitalism in its entirety to expressing disagreement with particular outcomes of capitalism. Within this, there is also range by the way in which people disagree with capitalism and what they want. Criticism of capitalism comes from various political and philosophical approaches, including anarchist, socialist, religious, and nationalist viewpoints. Some believe that capitalism can only be overcome through revolution, while others believe that structural change can come slowly through political reforms. Some critics believe that there are merits in capitalism and wish to balance it with some form of social control, typically through government regulation, for example, social market movement. Prominent among critiques of capitalism are accusations that capitalism is inherently exploitative, unsustainable, and creates economic inequality, is anti-democratic, and leads to an erosion of human rights, while it incentivizes imperialist expansions and war. According to contemporary critics of capitalism, rapid industrialization in Europe created working conditions that are now viewed as unfair, including 14-hour working days, child labor, and shanty towns. Some modern economists argue that average living standards did not improve, or that only very slowly improved before 1840. Early socialist thinkers reject capitalism altogether, attempting to create socialist communities free of the perceived injustices of early capitalism. Among these utopian socialists were Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels released the Communist Manifesto, which outlined a political and economic critique of capitalism based on the philosophy of historic materialism. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a contemporary of Marx, was another notable critic of capitalism and was also one of the first to call himself an anarchist. By the early 20th century, myriad socialist tendencies, for example Bolshevism, had arisen based on different interpretations of current events. Governments also began placing restrictions on market operations and created interventionist programs, attempting to ameliorate perceived market shortcomings, for example the New Deal. Starting with the 1917 Russian Revolution, communist states increased in numbers and a Cold War started with the development of capitalist nations. Following the revolutions of 1989, many of these communist states adopted market economies. The notable exceptions to this trend have been North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela, and the latter instituting a philosophy referred to as socialism of the 21st century. So let's dissect the extremes of the argument. We'll start with anarchism. The authors of An Anarchist state that anarchists have long since recognized that capitalism is by very nature hierarchical. The worker is subjected to the authority of the boss during working hours, sometimes outside work too. They state, this hierarchical control of wage labor has the effect of alienating workers from their own work, and so from themselves. Workers no longer govern themselves during working hours, and so are no longer free. According to them, this is why capitalism, by treating as labor as analogous to other commodities, denies the key distinction between labor and other resources, that is to say, it is inseparable from its bearer, labor, unlike other property which is endowed with will and agency. Thus, when one speaks of selling labor, there is a necessary subjection of will, hierarchy. Creative self-managed work is a source of pride and joy, and part of what it means to be a full human. Wrenching control of work from the hands of the worker profoundly harms his or her mental and physical health. Capitalism itself was created by state violence, and the destruction of traditional ways of life and social interaction was part of that task. From the start, bosses spent considerable time and energy combating the attempts of working people to join together to resist the hierarchy they were subjected to and reassert human values. Such forms of free association between equals, such as trade unions, were also combated, just as attempts to regulate the worst excess of the system by democratic governments. Indeed, capitalists do prefer centralized or elitist and/or authoritarian regimes precisely because they are sure to be outside of the popular control. They are the only way that contractual relations based on market power can be enforced on unwilling populations. For the influential German individualist and anarchist philosopher Max Stirner, private property is viewed as a, quote, spook, which lives, quote, by the grace of law and becomes mine only by the effect of law. In other words, private property exists purely through the protection of the state, through the state's grace. Recognizing its need for state protection, Stirner is also aware that, and to quote, it need not make any difference to the good citizens who protect them and their principles, whether an absolute king or a constitutional one, or a republic, if only they are protected. And what is their principle? Whose protector they always love? Not that of labor. Rather it is interest-bearing possession, laboring capital. Therefore, labor, certainly, yet little or none at all of one's own, but labor of capital and of the subjected laborers. French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon opposed French government privileges that protects capitalist, banking and land interests and the accumulation or acquisition of property, and any form of coercion that led to it, which he believes hampers competition and keeps the wealth in the hands of few. The Spanish individualist and anarchist Miguel Giménez Igualada, I think that's how you pronounce it, I apologize if I'm wrong, sees, and to quote, capitalism is an effect of government. The disappearance of government means capitalism falls from its pedestal vertiginously. That which we call capitalism is not something else but a product of the state, within which the only thing that is being pushed forward is profit, good or badly acquired, and so, to fight against capitalism is a pointless task, since it must be state capitalism or enterprise capitalism. As long as the government exists, exploiting capital will exist. The fight, but of consciousness, is against the state. Emma Goldman denounced wage slavery by saying, and to quote, the only difference is that you are hired slaves instead of block slaves. Within anarchism, there emerged a critique of wage slavery, which refers to a situation perceived as quasi-voluntary slavery, whereby a person's livelihood depends on wages, essentially when the dependence is totally immediate. It is a negatively connotated term used to draw an analogy between slavery and wage labor by forcing on similarities between owning and renting a person. The term wage slavery has been used to criticize economic exploitation and social stratisfaction, with the former seen primarily as unequal bargaining power between labor and capital, particularly when workers are paid comparatively low wages, for example in sweatshops, and the latter as a lack of workers' self-management, fulfilling job choices such as the leisure in an economy. Libertarian socialists believe that if freedom is valued, then society must work towards a system in which individuals have the power to decide economic issues along with political issues. Libertarian socialists often seek to replace unjustified authority with direct democracy, voluntary federation and popular autonomy in all aspects of life, including philosophical and physical communities and economic enterprises. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, thinkers such as Proudhon and Marx elaborated the comparison between wage labor and slavery in the context of critique of social and societal propriety, not intended for active personal use. To reference an earlier quote that I laid, The American anarchist Emma Goldman believed that the economic system of capitalism was incompatible with human liberty. She says that the only demand that property recognizes is its own gluttonous appetite for greater wealth, because wealth means power, the power to subdue, to crush, to exploit, the power to enslave, to outrage, to degrade. She also argued that capitalism dehumanizes workers, turning the producer into a mere particle, a machine with less will and decision than his master of steel and iron. Noam Chomsky contends that there is little moral difference between chattel slavery and renting oneself to an owner, or, as we quoted earlier, wage slavery. He feels that it is an attack on personal integrity that undermines individual freedom. He holds that workers should own and control their own workplace. Having explored the ideas of anarchists, I think that it is important to look at the other side. So, in the idea of fairness, let's analyze the traditionalist principles. Edmund Burke accepted the liberal ideas of private property and the economics of Adam Smith, but he thought that economics should remain subordinate to the conservative social ethic, that capitalism should be subordinate to the medieval social tradition, and that the business class should be subordinate to the aristocracy. Distributism is an economic ideology asserting that the world's productive assets should be widely owned rather than concentrated. It was developed in Europe in the late 19th and earlier 20th centuries based upon the principles of Catholic social teaching, especially the teachings of Pope Leo VIII in his ecclesiastical Rerum Novarum in 1891. It views both capitalism and socialism as equally flawed and exploitative. It favors economic mechanisms such as small-scale cooperatives and family businesses, and large-scale antitrust regulations. In Conservatives Against Capitalism, Peter Klosai relies on Norberto Bobbi's definition of left and right, dividing the two camps according to their preference for equality or hierarchy. Klosai argued that capitalism has faced persistent criticism from the right since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Critics such, while in heterogeneisms, are united in the belief that laissez-faire capitalism has undermined an established social hierarchy governed by the virtues of excellence. For all their differences, there is one key aspect of intellectual history charting in Conservatives Against Capitalism that deals with an issue of shared concern on both the left and the right: the need for community. One of the grim consequences of social Darwinian pressures unleashed by free market capitalism has been the destruction of networks of community, family, and professional associations in developed societies. These so-called intermediate institutions have historically played a vital role in giving ordinary people a sense of meaning and in turn protecting them from the structural violence of the state and the market. Their loss has led to the creation of huge class autonomized and lonely people cut adrift from traditional sources of support and left alone to contend with the power of impersonal economic forces. Now you may be wondering that to begin with I looked at anarchist ideology, which is undoubtedly one of the most extremist, and while many today may disagree with the idea of traditionalism, I think that upon closer inspection it does not seem to have anything too extreme. Therefore, in the idea of equal analysis, I'm going to attempt to dissect the economic aspects of fascism and how it links to capitalism critique. Fascists oppose international socialism and free market capitalism, arguing that their views represented a third way and claiming to provide a realistic economic alternative that was neither laissez-faire capitalism nor communism. They favored corporatism and class collaboration, believing that the existence of inequality and social hierarchy has benefited, contrary to the views of the socialists, while also arguing that the state had a role in mediating relations between classes, also contrary to the views of economic liberals. I don't particularly want to stray too much into the ideas of fascist economic policy in this video, and so I just thought it would be best to bring out some of the key ideas, and I'm not going to go into too much depth. But I think we can overall conclude that fascists were against capitalism because it didn't have such strong hierarchical views as they would have liked without that government predecessor. So, having looked at the extremes of both ends, but only the moderate of the right, which was the traditionalist views, I'm going to attempt to explain socialist economic policy with the idea of being fair. I'm trying my best to balance all things out like a good little centrist. Socialists argue that the accumulation of capital generates waste through externalities that require costly corrective regulatory measures. They also point out that this process generates wasteful industries and practices that exist only to generate sufficient demand for products to be sold at a profit, such as high-pressure advertisement, therefore creating rather than satisfying economic demand. Socialists also argue that capitalism consists of irrational activity, such as purchasing of commodities only to sell at a later time when their price appreciates, which is known as speculation in the economic world, rather than for consumption. Therefore, a crucial criticism often made by socialists is that making money or accumulation of capital does not correspond to the satisfaction of demand, the product of use values. The fundamental criterion for economic activity in capitalism is the accumulation of capital for reinvestment in production. This spurs the development of new non-productive industries that do not produce use value and only exist to keep the accumulation process afloat. An example of a non-productive industry is the financial industry, which contributes to the formation of economic bubbles. Socialists view private property as relations as limiting as potential of productive forces in the economy. According to socialists, private property becomes obsolete when it concentrates into centralized, socialized institutions based on private appropriation of revenue, but based on cooperative work and internal planning of allocation of inputs, until the role of the capitalist becomes redundant with no need for capital accumulation and class of owners. Private property of means of production is perceived as being an outdated form of economic organization that should be replaced by free association of individuals based on public or common ownership of these socialized assets. So the overall belief is that private ownership imposes constraints on planning, leading to uncoordinated economic decisions that result in businesses fluctuating, unemployment, and tremendous waste of materials, resources during crises. They believe that excessive disparities in income distribution lead to social instability and require costly corrective measures in the form of redistributive taxation. This incurs heavy administrative costs while weakening the incentive to work, inviting dishonesty and increasing the likelihood of tax evasion, the corrective measures, while reducing the overall efficiency of the market economy. These corrective policies limit the market's incentive system by providing things such as minimum wages, unemployment insurance, taxing profits, and reducing the reserve army of labor, resulting in reduced incentives for capitalists to invest more in production. In essence, social welfare policies cripple capitalism's incentive and are thus unsustainable in the long run. Marxists argue that the establishment of socialist mode of production is only a way to overcome these deficiencies. Socialists, and especially Marxian socialists, argue that the inherent conflict of interest between the working class and capital prevent optimal use of available human resources and leads to contradictory interests of groups, labor and business, striving to influence the state to intervene in the economy at the expense of overall economic efficiency. Early socialists, such as the utopian socialists that we discussed earlier, criticized capitalism for concentrating power and wealth within a small segment of society, who do not utilize available technology and resources to their maximum potential in the interests of the public. This is also linked to socialism and libertarianism. During the age of the Enlightenment, some proponents of liberalism were criticized of wage slavery. On the other hand, some modern-day liberals are critical of the laissez-faire capitalism and support a social market economy, while others are critical of the mixed economy welfare state and advocate either its abolition in favor of a laissez-faire capitalism or reduction of its role in favor of free market capitalism. Now, I am aware of how historically based this video has been so far, but I want to look at one more aspect of the economic spectrum, and that is Marxism. Karl Marx saw capitalism as a historical stage, once progressive but which would eventually stagnate due to internal contradictions, which would eventually be followed by socialism. Marx stated that capitalism was nothing more than a necessary stepping stone for the progression of man, which would then face political revolution before embracing the classless society. Marxists defined capital as a social economic relation between people, rather than between people and things. In this sense, they seek to abolish capital. They believe that private ownership of means of production enriches capitalists, owners of capital, at the expense of the workers. The richer get richer and the poorer get poorer. In brief, they argue that the owners of the means of production do not work and therefore exploit the workforce. In Marx's view, the capitalists would eventually accumulate more and more capital, impoverishing the working class, creating the social conditions for a revolution that would overthrow the institution of capitalism. Private ownership over the means of production and distribution is seen as a dependency of non-owning classes and the ruling class, and ultimately a source of restriction of human freedom. Marxists have offered various related lines of argument, creating and claiming that capitalism is a contradiction-laden system characterized by recurring cries coming from the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and having a tendency towards increasing severity. Overall, under Marxist ideology, capitalism refers to a stage of history in which there is a class system in which the proletariat is exploited by the bourgeoisie. So, having gone through as brief a historical economic view as possible for such a video, let's take a look at some of the most prevalent critiques of capitalism. Number 1. Democracy and freedom. Economist Branko Horvat stated that it is now well known that capitalist development leads to the concentration of capital, employment, and power. It is somewhat lesser known, however, that it leads to the almost complete destruction of economic freedom. Critics argue that capitalism leads to a significant loss of political, democratic, and economic power for the vast majority of the global human population. The reason for this is that they believe capitalism creates very large concentrations of money and property in the hands of a relatively small minority of global human population, the powerful elite, as some say, leading, they say, to very large and increasing wealth and income inequalities between the elite and the majority of the population. Corporate capitalism and inverted totalitarianism are terms used by the aforementioned activists and the critics of capitalism to describe the capitalist marketplace and society characterized by the dominance of hierarchical, bureaucratic, large corporations which are legally required to pursue profit without concern for social welfare. Corporate capitalism has been criticized for the amount of power and influence corporations and large businesses, interest groups have over government policy, including the policies of regulatory agencies and influencing political campaigns. Many social scientists have criticized corporations for failing to act in the interests of the people. They claim that the existence of large corporations seems to circumvent the principles of democracy, which assumes equal power relations between all individuals in society. As part for the political left, activists against corporate power and influence work towards a decreased income gap and improved income equality. The rise of giant multinational corporations has been a topic of concern among the aforementioned scholars, intellectuals, and activists who see large corporations as leading to deep structural erosion of such basic human rights and civil rights as equatable with wealth and income distribution, equatable democratic, political, and socio-economic power representation, and many other human rights and needs. They have pointed out that, in their view, large corporations create false needs in consumers, and, they contended, to have had a long history of interference and in distortion of the policies of sovereign nation-states through high-priced legal lobbying and, other than almost legal ways, powerful forms of influence peddling. In their view, evidence supporting this belief includes invasive advertising such as billboards, television ads, adware, spam, telemarketing, child-targeted advertising, and guerrilla marketing, massive open or secret corporate political campaign contributions, so-called democratic elections. Anti-corporate activists express the view that large corporations answer only to large shareholders, giving human rights issues and social justice issues, environmental issues, and other issues of high significance to the bottom 99% of the global human population virtually no consideration. American political philosopher Jody Dean says that contemporary economic and financial calamities have dispelled the notion that capitalism is a viable economic system, adding that the fantasy that democracy exerts a force for economic justice has dissolved as the US government funnels trillions of dollars to banks and European central banks, rig national governments, and cut social programs to keep themselves afloat. David Sharkwood wrote, and to quote, "Ordinary people, in capitalist societies, are deemed competent enough to select their political leaders, but not to be their bosses. Contemporary capitalism celebrates democracy, yet it denies our democratic rights at precisely the point where they might be utilized to most immediate and concretely points, at the place where we would spend the most of active and alert hours of our adult lives." Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the United States, said, "I hope that we shall crush in its birth aristocracy our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to trial strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." Number 2. The exploitation of workers. Critics of capitalism view the system as inherently exploitative in an economic sense. Exploitation is often related to the exploitation of labor for profit, as based on Karl Marx's version of the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value was supported by classical economists such as David Ricardo and Adam Smith, who believed that the value of a commodity depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its product. In Das Kapital, Marx identified that the commodity as the basic unit of capital organization. Marx described a common denominator between commodities, in particular that commodities are the product of labor and are related to each other by an exchange value, so the price. By using the labor theory of value, Marxists see a connection between labor and exchange value, in that commodities are exchanged depending on the socially necessary labor time needed to produce them. However, due to the productive forces of industrial organization, laborers are being seen as creating more exchange value during the course of the working day than the cost of their survival, food, shelter, clothing, and so on. And therefore, Marxists argue that capitalists are thus able to pay for the cost of survival whilst exploiting the excess labor. Marxists further argue that due to economic inequality, the purchase of labor cannot occur under free conditions. Since capitalists control means of production, for example the factories, businesses, machinery, and so on, the workers control their labor. The work is naturally coerced into allowing their labor to be exploited. Critics argue that the exploitation occurs even if the exploited consents, since the definition of exploitation is independent of consent. In essence, workers must allow their labor to be exploited or face starvation. Since some degree of unemployment is typical in modern economies, Marxists argue that wages are naturally driven down in the free market systems. Hence, even if a worker contests their wages, capitalists are able to find someone from the reserve army of labor who is more desperate. Number 3. Imperialism and political oppression. Critics of capitalism, for example John Bellamy Foster and Robert W. Mackenzie, argue that the system is responsible for not only economic exploitation, but also imperialist, colonial, and counter-revolutionary wars and repressions of workers and trade unions. Near the start of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin wrote that the state use of military power to defend capitalist interests abroad was inevitably corollary of monopoly capitalism. He argued that capitalism needs imperialism in order to survive. According to Lenin, the export of financial capital supersedes the exploitation of commodities, banking, and industrial capital, merged to form large financial cartels and trusts in which production and distribution are highly centralized. The monopoly capitalists influence states to carve up the world into spheres of interest. These trends lend their states to defend their capital interests abroad through military power. The military-industrial complex mentioned in D. Eisenhower's presidential farewell address appears to play a significant role in the American capitalist system. It may be one of the driving forces of American militarism and invention abroad. Number 4. Inefficiency, irrationality, and unpredictability. Some opponents criticize capitalism's inefficiency. They note that a shift from the pre-industrial reuse and thriftiness before capitalism to a consumer-based economy that pushes ready-made materials. It is argued that a sanitation industry arose under capitalism that deemed trash valueless, a significant break from the past when much waste was used and reused almost indefinitely. In the process, critics say that capitalism has created a profit-driven system based on selling as many products as possible. Critics relate the ready-made trend to a growing garbage problem in which 4.5 pounds of trash are generated per person each day, comparing the 2.7 pounds in the 1960s and showing it to be an extremely flawed system in that sense. Anti-capitalist groups with an emphasis on conservation include eco-socialists and social ecologists. Planned obsolescence has been criticized as wasteful practice under capitalism. By designing products to wear out faster than need be, new consumption is generated. This would benefit corporations by increasing sales while at the same time generating excessive waste. A well-known example is the charger that Apple has designed its iPod to fail after 18 months. Critics view planned obsolescence as wasteful and inefficient use of resources. Other authors, such as Naomi Klein, have criticized brand-based marketing for putting more emphasis on the company's name brand than on manufacturing products. Some economists, most notably Marian economists, argue that the system of perpetual capital accumulation leads to irrational outcomes and a misallocation of resources as industries and jobs are created for the sake of making money, as opposed to satisfying actual demands and needs. Number 5. Market failure. Market failure is a term used by economists to describe the condition where the allocation of goods and services by a market is not efficient. Paul Krugman views this scenario in which individuals' pursuit of self-interest leads to bad results for society as a whole. John Maynard Keynes preferred economic invention by government to free markets. Some believe that the lack of perfect information and perfect competition in a free market also generates these kinds of inequalities in the market, and therefore others perceive certain unique problems with a free market, including monopolies, monospheres, inside trading, and price gouging. Number 6. Inequality. Critics of capitalism often argue that capitalism is associated with many levels of inequality within its bases, and an unfair distribution of wealth and power, a tendency towards market monopoly or oligarchies, imperialism and counter-revolutionary wars, and various forms of economic and cultural exploitation, the repression of workers and trade unionists, and phenomena such as social alienation, economic inequality, unemployment, and economic instability. Critics have argued that there is an inherent tendency towards the apocalyptic structures when laissez-faire is combined with the capitalist private property. Capitalism is regarded by many socialists to be irrational in that production, and that the direct and the economy are unplanned, creating many inconsistencies and internal contradictions that should thus be controlled through public policy. In the early 20th century, Vladimir Lenin argued that the state uses of military power to defend capitalist interests abroad was inevitable corollary of monopoly and capitalism. In a 1965 letter to Carlos Coelho, I also think that's how you pronounce it, apologies if it's wrong, editor of Marcha, a weekly newspaper published in Montevideo in Uruguay, Che Guevara wrote that the laws of capitalism, which are blind and invisible to ordinary people, act upon the individual without he or she being aware of it. One sees only the vastness of seemingly infinite horizon ahead. That is how it is painted by capitalist propagandists who purport to draw a lesson from the example of Rockefeller, whether or not this is true, about the possibilities of individual success. The amount of poverty and suffering required for a Rockefeller to emerge, and the amount of depravity entailed in the accumulation of such a fortune and magnitude are left out of the picture, and it is not always possible for the popular forces to expose this clearly. It is a contest among wolves. One can win only at the cost of failure of others. Number 7. Market instability. Critics of capitalism, particularly Marxists, identify market instability as a permanent feature of capitalist economies. Marx believed that the unplanned and explosive growth of capitalism does not occur in a smooth manner, but is interrupted by periods of overproduction in which stagnation or decline occur. In the view of Marxists, several contradictions in the capitalist mode of production are present, particularly the internal contradiction between anarchy and the sphere of capital, for example, the free market, and socialized production in the sphere of labor, for example, industrialism. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels highlighted what they saw as a uniquely capitalist juxtaposition of overabundance and poverty. To quote, they said, "Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, and too much commerce." 8. Property. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Friedrich Engels argue that the free market is not necessarily free, but weighed towards those who already own private property. They view capitalist regulations, including the enforcement of private property on land and exclusive rights to natural resources, as unjustly enclosing upon what should be owned by all, forcing those without private property to sell their labor to capitalists and landlords in a market favorable to the latter, thus forcing workers to accept low wages in order to survive. In his criticism of capitalism, Proudhon believed that the emphasis on private property is the problem. He argued that property is theft, arguing that private property leads to dispossession. Now, property necessarily engenders dispossession, but the government of caprice and the regime of libidinous pleasure. That is so clearly the essence of property that to be convinced of it, one needs to remember what is and observe that what has happened around him. Property is right to the use and to abuse. Many left-wing anarchists, such as anarchist communists, believe in replacing capitalist private property with a system where people can lay claim to things based on personal use and claim, and that private property is a denomination of an individual, or a coalition of individuals over things. It is not the claim of any person or persons to use of these things, and this is unfruitful in different matters. Property means the monopoly of wealth, and the right to prevent others using it, whether the owner needs it or not. Number 9. Sustainability. One of the main modern criticisms to the sustainability of capitalism is related to the so-called commodity chains or production-consumption chains. These terms refer to the network of transfers or materials and commodities that is currently part of the functioning of the global capitalist system. Examples include high-tech commodities produced in countries with low average wages by multinational firms and then being sold in distant high-income countries, materials and sources being extracted in some countries, turned into finishing products in some, and sold as commodities in further ones. And countries exchanging with others are the same kind of commodities for the sake of consumers' choice. For example, Europe both exporting and importing cars from and to the United States. According to critics, such processes, all of which project pollution and waste of resources, are an integral part of the functioning of capitalism. For example, its metabolism is an often used word when describing this feature. Critics note that the statistical methods used in these calculations, ecological footprints, have been criticized, and some find that the whole concept of counting and how much land is used is to be flawed, arguing that there is nothing instinctively negative about using more land to improve living standards, rejection of the intrinsic value of nature. Many environmentalists who have long argued that the real dangers are due to the world's current social institutions claim that to promote environmentally irresponsible consumption and grow production. Under what we call, or they call, the grow or die imperative of capitalism, they say there is little reason to expect hazardous consumption and production practices to change in a timely manner. They also claim that markets and states are inevitably drag about their feet, and sustainability and environmental reform are notoriously slow to adopt viable, sustainable technologies. A team of Finnish scientists hired by the UN Secretary General to aid in the 2019 Global Sustainability Development Report asserted that capitalism as we know it is more bundly and primarily because it is focused on short-term profits and fails to look at the long-term needs of people and the environment which it is being subjected to. So overall, the scientists are saying that a new economic model, one which focuses on sustainability and efficiency and not profit and growth, will be needed as the decades of robust economic growth driven by abundant resources and cheap energy is rapidly coming to a close. So having broken down the failures of capitalism, it is beginning to seem rather bleak. I mean, schools also do this kind of thing where they spend years teaching us about why capitalism is terrible and how it leads to suffering, but then they proceed to just push us into the capitalist workplace. I, however, am not a school, and I want to entertain revolution in this video. In an attempt to answer that question, let's look at another first. If capitalism is so bad, why do we endure it? Let's look at how people attempt to defend capitalism. When doing research for this video, I came to the conclusion that the biggest and most widely accepted defense of capitalism is the simple statement of, "There is nothing better." And that seems even more bleak. But upon closer analysis, that isn't true. Freeing the economic market and demonopolizing it is not an extremist idea that would lead to such an extent of reform that a totalitarian government would be instated. Marx wrote that, in order for there to be a revolution, capitalism has to fail first. And, had I said this a year ago, I would have been pretty stuck with how to tie up this question. However, I think the pandemic has made room for some reform. The pandemic has led to innumerable deficiencies in our economic system. Capitalism hasn't failed, but it has been shaking, and this leaves room for slight reform. So what kind of reform? Well, I think, as I previously stated, that our end goal should be to free the market and demonopolize our economy. I think that this will come about over time, especially as many have begun to find passion in innovation over lockdown. So, do I disagree with capitalism? Yes. But do I believe in the revolution? Well, not entirely, but that's for a different discussion. In conclusion, capitalism is failing us as it prevents movement. Yes, we live in a society that allows for more social mobility than ever before in history, but it is still far more limited than most people think. Essentially, if you keep giving the most and best to the 1%, that is historically when people will start to build guillotines. So that brings us to the end of today's video. I would love to hear what you have to say and what you think about what I've said, and I'm open to different opinions, and perhaps we can get some discussion going in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, however, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. And also subscribe. I post one new video every week, some in a similar vein like this, and I also have a literature series where I dissect some of my favorite novels and also just novels that I think are really good. So yeah, please subscribe for that, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you and have a nice day.